Hello there. I hope you guys are ready for the Nikke collab with Hololive. What do you mean what's wrong? I mean, people have been asking for a Hololive collab since forever, right? So now we have Hololive at home. Anyways, let's first talk about her kit. Her first skill, Admire Accompaniment, activates after landing 30 attacks. It deals damage to the target for 131.34% of the final attack as damage, and also activates when entering full burst. It affects all allies, and the effects change according to the number of activations. All the previous effects apply continuously. So the first time it will be cooldown of burst skill of 1.82 seconds, the second time it will be cooldown of burst skill down by 2.2 seconds, and the third time would be cooldown of burst skill by 2.6 seconds, for a grand total of 6.62 seconds total for every third and onwards burst activation. Her second skill, Aegis Cannon Suppression Fire, has an internal cooldown of 4 seconds and affects one enemy randomly. This is very important, it's random. It deals 105.58% of final attack as damage, and for the same target that it has affected, if they belong to Electric Code, they will take damage increase by 5.64%, and it stacks up to 5 times, lasting 5 seconds. Assuming it does not disappear, this will stack up to 28.2%. And assuming the target doesn't disappear for longer than 1 second, it will always be there and it will stack up no matter what between 16 to 20 seconds, depending on when the skill first triggers. Her burst skill, Aegis Cannon Overload, has a cooldown of 20 seconds, so this is pretty good because she's a burst 2 Nikke, and it affects all enemies. It deals 164.83% of final attack as damage, and it will affect the same target again, or targets, if they belong to Electro Code, dealing an additional 164.83% of final attack as damage. So this stacks up to 329.66% of final attack as AoE damage to the targets if the enemies are electrocoded. So the question is, should you pull? Technically, she is a safe skip because she's very niche in what she does, so she will serve more as some sort of backup for further teams in solo raid and union raid. But do keep in mind that she is limited, so you won't be able to get her until her rerun, which is something to keep in mind, and her niche will grow as the game expands and more electro-coded enemies and bosses are added into the game. So I will still say she is technically a safe skip, unless you're a collector and you don't want to wait possibly a full year for a rerun. Let us go into her specifics though. Her S1 is a typical damage ability with a cooldown ability. It's identical to the cooldown reduction of Dola, Leader and Volume, so beyond its cooldown and damage combination, there's not that much to say about it. It's an okay skill, but nothing to write home about. What it does allow though is to reduce the cooldown of burst 1 Nikkes that don't have built-in cooldown reductions, such as Miranda for example if you're going for a Snow White composition. This allows you to basically burst on rotation, which is very good to have if you're going that route. Her second skill is where things get interesting and weird. It will hit one random enemy every 4 seconds for 105% of final attack, and the target hit, if it's an electro-coded enemy, will receive a stackable debuff. The stackable debuff will last for 5 seconds, stacks up to 5 times, and is for 5.64%. That's a lot of 5s, but it adds up at maximum stacks to 28.2%. It's not that far away from Blanc's own damage amplification debuff, but it's still not the 39.2% for 10 seconds that she gives, which is pretty massive comparatively. But in her case, this damage amplification debuff is permanent, as long as the target doesn't disappear for longer than 1 second, and as long as you don't have multiple targets on the field that this skill can randomly hit, in which case, well, your stacks will absolutely disappear. What should be considered though is when it activates. If it activates as soon as you start your level, then within 16-ish seconds, you will have it at max stacks. If it activates 4 seconds after you begin the level, it will stack up to max within 20 seconds. So that is something to take into consideration, and because it's an off burst automatic skill, it means that you can pair her with other things because it's not tied to her burst. So you can tie her to other burst 2 Nikkes that will buff up. So for example, you could pair her with Poly for burst 2 options, and same for the cooldown reduction, it's not tied to her burst. So all of these feeds into this idea of Snow White compositions that could make use of this. Assuming you're using a Snow White composition against an electro-coded enemy, you can use even Christmas Anne, for example, to fight these enemies and not lose the possibility of entering full burst onwards, as she is a 20-second burst 2 Nikke that could serve as a backup. Something as well to keep into consideration is the fact that this damage amplification debuff that is permanent, assuming it keeps hitting the same target, is against electro-coded enemies. It's enemy-based and not elemental-based or your Nikke-based. It's based on the code of your enemies, which means that you don't need to run iron-coded Nikkes to make use of this. Of course, you will technically get more bang for your buck, as they will have elemental advantage, but you could still run her with other things, which is not as limiting as you would believe. The main limiting factor, of course, being encountering electro-coded enemies to make use of it. Hochimachi's burst skill is an AoE, which can kind of seem like a contradiction with her S2 at first glance, but if it can wipe out the enemies before her S2 changes targets, which can be a little bit iffy, but it is possible, it could have a good synergy there, especially for bosses that summon adds. It also deals double damage to electro-coded enemies on a 20-second cooldown. So that extra damage towards electro-coded enemies is not negligible. Assuming you're fighting an electro-coded enemy, that damage being doubled will be very close to Chocobunny. So Suisei's own burst would be at 329%, and Chocobunny is sitting at 351%. So it's not that bad in terms of damage if you use that as a frame of reference. Although, all in all, looking at her skill 1, skill 2, and burst, she is a very niche unit that you will mostly use for solo raid and union raid, for team 3, 4, 5, as kind of like once you have exhausted your main teams. She also has the potential of becoming a staple in Elysian Tower, since she would be one of the strongest options for burst 2, when it comes to clearing such restricted content. Now, her synergies are, in a sense, obvious, but at the same time they aren't. The most obvious synergy available to run her with would be Snow White teams or very strong burst teams in Iron Code department, so it would be Maxwell, Snow White, to some extent Lapchan. This allows you to run stuff like Polly and Christmas Anne in the case of Snow White, because you have a 20-second burst 2 that kind of buffs Snow White off of the burst. That can also serve as a backup burst once those very long burst cooldowns like Polly and Christmas Anne have happened. So this has always been my biggest gripe running Polly against bosses, is that if you cannot one-shot, you would generally need a second burst 2 unit. Which usually is not a very good option, because up until now you didn't have things that would buff Snow White even further off of the burst, because Polly's attack buff is tied to the burst. Now Summer Helm is a very good option when it comes to fighting electro-coded Nikkes. She also provides that cooldown reduction being on burst 2, which would allow Miranda to be an even more viable option, so that you can burst on cooldown, because if you run Miranda without cooldown reduction Nikkes, you will be stuck 4 to 5 seconds without being able to burst, assuming you generate the burst quickly enough. So this is pretty good, and I will probably run her in some of my Snow White comps whenever I need cooldown reduction or want to run Polly or burst 2 Nikkes that enhance my Snow White, so that she further enhances Snow White. Now, I might not run her with Dorothy when I'm running for damage amplification, but this will give me more flexibility when it comes to solo raid, as well as union raid. Interestingly enough, as I mentioned previously, you can run her with iron-coded Nikkes, but you don't really have to. Her effects when it comes to damage amplification are enemy-based, which means that you don't really have any restrictions when it comes to the Nikkes you put with her. You're only restricted to the enemies you want to have those effects against. Which means that theoretically you could run her with whatever powerful Nikkes you have and still benefit from that damage amplification that stacks on electro-coated enemies. Which is a big benefit in the sense that there are not that many iron-coated Nikkes at the moment, so running alternatives and still making use of her abilities versus electro-coated enemies is very good. Now, technically, while I mention all of this, you gotta remember as well that what will give you the biggest bang for your buck, of course, will be iron-coated Nikkes because they will have elemental advantage over the targets of those debuff effects that Helm has. So do keep that in mind, but also don't pigeonhole yourself into only running iron Nikkes. You technically don't have to, even though in an ideal situation you would want to run iron Nikkes for the elemental advantage over the enemy. Now, for Arena, she's not exactly ideal because she's an AR Nikke, so her burst generation is quite low. Not as low as SMG's, for example, but it is quite low. She does provide a kind of constant-ish stream of damage, but it's not exactly ideal. It will do damage towards electro-coated Nikke, so for example, if you run her versus an Annis comp or a Maiden comp or whatever, yes, technically she will do more damage and she will amplify the damage against them. But will her damage be justifiable to slow down your burst generation so much in a quick burst meta like we have currently? Probably not. It will be very, very iffy. In terms of arena synergies, well, you will mostly place her in teams that will compensate her lower burst generation, and you will use her against electro-heavy teams such as Summer Annis. Realistic usage though, I don't know how realistic it will be, but it is worth mentioning. Now, this will be it for my Helm hot take. If you like the video, be sure to subscribe for more future hot takes, and I would like to apologize for delivering it this late. I just got a very harsh reminder not to take too much time with my quote-unquote homework because I got taken out by a summer cold for 2 full days, and this delayed the production of the video by quite a bit. As always, thanks a lot for the support, and especially since we're getting closer to that 1K sub. See you again, and thanks a lot.